you are the beautiful community, and your job is to help me breathe, and my job is to be a little bit of an intellectual taxi for you today, because you've requested, four of you have requested, that I do a little breakdown of Gary Stevenson's appearance on The Rest is Politics leading podcast with Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell. So I'm going to react by saying a few things that I think nobody can deny about how bad inequality is. So we'll be sort of agreeing with Gary. Then I probably will throw in something about what I think Alistair and Rory sometimes miss in some of their interviews, and did on this occasion. And lastly, I'll say where I think I depart from Gary. Something like that. Shall we give this a little go? Let's try to keep it under 10 minutes. Inequality is so bad in Western society today, concentrations of wealth are so extreme that we have a situation where, whatever your ideological perspective, you don't get to keep your democracy for long with these levels of inequality. Because democracy is to some extent predicated on shared experience among citizens. And if citizens spectacularly fail to participate in shared experiences, you've got a problem. If citizens fail to feel a degree of dignity and pride about their work, you've got a problem. If citizens fail to feel a degree of pride in their work that is then linked to a sense of patriotism, you've got a problem keeping your democracy. So that means we are in trouble in a way that's simply about the interaction between economic exclusion and trust. There is nothing you can do ideologically to come over the top of this. You can't come in here and say, well, I am a conservative and therefore I believe in an X position on taxation, and therefore any redistribution policy beyond that will just be unethical. Well, you can say that, but you'll just lose your democracy. So you don't need to be left-wing to say that we've got an unsustainable degree of economic exclusion. For anybody who doesn't want to have a bunch of Viktor Orbáns elected and then being stuck in office such that you can't kick them out. I think the second thing that I probably agree about with Gary is that we are absolutely on track to have the hard right, populist, exclusionary, post-truth hard right in power in many European countries. And we already got that in the United States, and in fact we've got a mild version there of what we will have in the 2030s unless we're very effective at challenging it. We're going to have a much more systematic and strategic and hard-nosed authoritarianism coming to the United States in the 2030s than the disorganized theatrics of Trump. As horrifically damaging as they are, and they are. So that's the trend, and unless you engage in some exercises of economic of political democratic regeneration and economic democratization, that's where we are heading. The default for Western politics is, unfortunately, a species of Trumpism. And note that Trumpism is itself a species of Putinism. And about that, health allowing, we'll say more on the main channel soon. And I think there's something else I agree with Gary. And that's that we can't talk politics the way we're talking politics and keep our democracies. That technocratic centrist discourse has expired. It's at too great a distance from the private sentiments of citizens to be convincing. Remember, in any human social formation, there's got to be a distance between private sentiment and public discourse, whereby they shouldn't be too close to one another, but they also shouldn't drift too far from one another. You don't want public discourse just becoming private sentiment. That's what happens with irresponsible populism. And you don't want private sentiment being eaten up by public discourse, whereby people begin to, often in fear of political authority, mimic slogans, propaganda slogans at the kitchen table, rather what happened in the country I grew up in, the Soviet Union. So there is a great deal of room for a change in discourse, and we'll talk about what it means to engage in populist discourse, but institutionally and non-exclusionarily, right? So there is a room for inclusive pro-institutional populism. I agree with that, and I think that certain steps in that direction are an inevitable part of any package that slows the collapse of our social orders into a shit show. I think one thing that is very palpable, and this is ethically tricky always to raise, but I'm increasingly convinced we have to talk about it, is that when Rory, and now I'm talking about how Rory and Alistair did the interview, when Rory and Alistair tried to figure Gary out, there was a very big elephant in the room, speculatively or allegedly, let me say, neurodiversity. I won't say anything about Gary, but I'll say something like this. You can't understand Liz Truss, about whom Rory and Alistair go in circles and circles and circles trying to figure her out. You can't understand Donald Trump unless you understand neurodiversity. That includes ADHD and autism. What has often happened with Alistair and Rory is that they've sat around describing features of a particular neurodiversity in a person without having a clue about what they actually are, what they mean. And both Rory and Alistair are open and would enormously benefit, not just in their political analysis, but in their personal lives, if they became better informed about this. Just like other things that we're getting better informed about, mental health, physical health, we've got to catch up with neurodiversity because too many people in public life are neurodiverse in a way that absolutely affects the way they operate. So I won't say anything direct about Gary, except for saying one thing. And that's something I've spoken to you about already in other connections. And that's that there are some humans who take a lot of things that are true to be obviously true when they are just true without being obviously true. And very often the distance between somebody who agrees with you that something is true but doesn't think that it's obvious is actually greater than the distance between you and somebody who thinks that something you think is true is actually false. Where do I depart from Gary? I think there are two broad areas, right? One is that power is complex, and the other is that the crisis of trust is complex. Power is always about cause and effect, and cause and effect based theory of change. Who is going to do what, how, and when, and using which mechanisms to get from A to B. And that requires not just an absence of delusion, which is absence about what's possible, which is being wrong about what's possible, but also an absence of illusion, which is being wrong about the way things already are. And so what we can say is that economic exclusion is a huge thing, a really huge thing. But both how it and how other social ills are sustained or brought about or not alleviated, that's a very complex causal process, where you can't just pick a fairly narrow bunch of enemies and say either we get rid of these people or these people change their minds or these people start doing things differently and then we're going to fix the problem. You don't fix problems like that easily, which is why so often you know, various kinds of progressivism struggle when they reach power. Progressivism doesn't have to struggle in total when it reaches power, but there's often that risk when the complexity of power is underestimated, and when a diagnosis of what's wrong, of what is not working, right, at the level of institutions, at the level of state capacity, at the level of the, the human content inside these institutions, is conceived of too simply and too narrowly. So that's one conversation where I'm sure I'm going to divert and recommend you to divert from Gary. Now, another related point is about the complexity of the crisis of trust. My beloved intellectual enemy, John Rawls, really across his entire life made the point of staying out of conversations about sustenance of trust and collapse of trust, because he felt deeply that these just weren't a philosophical problem, because they were very, very largely a product of social forces that were only to a limited degree under our control. So, in fact, when Rawls wrote, he tended to say, anything I write should only apply to a social order that already has a high degree of trust, that already has a situation where citizens are prepared to engage with one another in terms of a sense of fairness. Notice, not a shared sense of fairness. In a modern pluralistic society, we're going to compete about what's fair, but a shared sense that we should deal in terms of plural senses of fairness, as opposed to throw fairness out of the window, because we don't have the trust to have relationships based on fairness with our fellow citizens. So Rawls just didn't want to go there, and in a certain sense, we can learn something from that. And of course, what we can learn is that the social forces that are causing the crisis of mistrust in our society are very plural. They're certainly economic, and economic exclusion is a huge factor there. They're also cultural. We've got various ideologies of a very atomistic kind, which proclaim to be collectivist, but they're not. Much hyper-identity politics has been an example of very, very individualistic ideologies of self-realization, where public good and solidarity are really values that are not within the horizon. There are social causes of distrust, the untethering of social bonds in our society in various ways. Bonds between people here today, bonds that are intergenerational. That's important too. There are historical factors to do with modernity and various forms of disenchantment in the modern world. There are technological factors, right? Here we are, right now, on a platform that we are benefiting from, but we're also kind of using against itself to engage in constructive public discourse. So, number one, we need a serious cause and effect account of power and a consequent theory of change. And that needs to be really three-dimensional. You can't get away with a two-dimensional picture of this. And secondly, we need to understand the complex roots, the various kinds of social forces that are behind our crisis of trust. The crisis of trust that's emotionally making us feel unsafe, powerless, betrayed, and giving us this appalling sense of opacity about our political environment, whereby we feel like that we can't see anything, can't make sense of anything, and thereby it might be okay to just give up on the whole show. My 2 cents. If you've seen the program, give me your 2 cents. Lots of love.